You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
Because of the following special program, Wonder Woman and the Incredible Hulk will not be presented this evening.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Making Tracks. Here are your hosts, Mark Newbold and Mark Mulcaster.
That's not true. That's impossible.
You're listening to episode 39 of Making Tracks. I'm your co-host Mark Newbold, and joining me today is a man who I imagine in my head is wearing like one of those lovely lounge jackets, and he's drinking tea with his little pinky sticking out and chocolate biscuits. Mark, what are you doing right now?
I'm sat in my boxer shorts.
That's it.
Sorry.
It's all good.
Sorry to dispel the illusion.
So we've got loads to talk about this episode. We're going to talk about Disney Gallery episode 4, which was awesome. We've got the first part of our interview with Hal Hickel. We'll talk about all the Mandalorian rumours and, of course, Empire at 40. We'll talk a little bit about Empire Strikes Back. But before we roll into the episode proper, a couple of people have passed away this month. Pink Shorts Boom Guy, you'll know him better as, but his name was Ken Nightingall. He passed away. He was 92 years old. Became a bit of a mini legend with the photographs of him on set in Tunisia filming A New Hope, and Charles Lippincott, who was the publicity guy on A New Hope, both passed away this week. Sad news, isn't it?
Yeah, very sad. I mean, 92 is a good innings. So, and I suppose we've mentioned this before in passing, and I think it's on everybody's mind really that the original cast and crew, they're getting up there in their years. So we are unfortunately losing people, every year, which is just sad. The impact that they had in film and obviously in the Star Wars fandom cannot be overstated. So rest in peace.
Absolutely, yeah, couldn't say it any better than that, really. So two more OT guys have passed away, but they won't be forgotten. I'm sure we'll be seeing plenty of Pink Shorts Boom guys at the next celebration, whenever that may be. And as you say, Charles Lippincott was a character. He was interesting to follow on social media. Just,
the last, few years, Charles posted a lot of interesting documents and articles about, his time back at the, proto Lucasfilm, really, as in its genesis, which is fascinating. And obviously it's, some of it's certain point of view stuff as well, potentially correcting popular held opinions and things of how events unfolded.
I'm Derek Arnold, and I get my news from Fantha Tracks.
Friday saw the latest episode of Disney Gallery The Mandalorian. It was the 4th episode looking at technology. Another awesome episode in a series that's been absolutely fascinating so far. What did you think of this episode? I know I was blown away by it.
This was the episode that I was really looking forward to the most. This was just a really well put together episode in respects that it covered the volume, the stagecraft, so the LED lighting kind of studio basically that they shot the bulk of Mandalorian in. It was done in a way that myself, who's very up on the technology of filming and production, could understand and relate, who didn't feel like I was being talked down to, but also my girlfriend sat next to me, understood and carried on with the episode. She didn't feel like she was kind of lost at any point. So it was a really well balanced episode in that respect, and just fascinating. I think it really starts to show how much impact and how pivotal Jon Favreau actually is as a producer and a director, not only now for Lucasfilm, but also just in Hollywood in general, which once upon a time you would just refer to Jon Favreau as a guy who started, the Iron Man trilogy and really kickstarted the MCU. But now you just think about what he's done before and even since then.
Yeah, it's funny. When we talked about episode 2 and everybody raved about how Filoni sort of explained that Phantom to Jedi run so concisely, and then the beginning of this was very much looking at Favreau's journey through VFX, and like I say, you forget, he directed Elf. He's not a new guy at this. He's been around for longer than, and you still kind of think of him as a relatively new guy, but I mean, he's a face as an actor that we've seen. And we were just talking before the show started, I was watching Friends this morning with a cup of tea. He was in an episode of, a few episodes of Friends, so he's been around forever, wasn't he?
Yeah, because he was Monica's boyfriend, and
the rich guy, yeah.
the rich guy who got into kind of cage fighting.
That's it. He wanted to become UFC world champion, but he's big enough as well. And of course, Happy Hogan in the Marvel films, and all that sort of stuff. You are up on the tech. I'm not, so I have like a very much a layman's. I kind of understand kind of what they're getting at when they talk about a lot of these technical terms. I know enough that I can hold a conversation, but I don't know any more than that. That's not my thing. The great thing about this episode was that it conveyed all of that in such a way, like you say, Karen was able to absorb it, I was able to absorb it, without being the tech expert. It was really, really well done.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also it kind of pulls the curtain back and hopefully is going to inspire other filmmakers and directors to think about using this technology, because the technology isn't necessarily new. It's basically taking components from various different things and actually combining them. That's the unique thing. So actually, they're using a game engine. So for computer games, which I haven't...
Unreal Engine,
the Unreal Engine. And then obviously it's the LED panels which have been developed just because that's what's happened through display kind of evolution with HDR. And also then obviously the camera motion kind of data that they're able to capture. So it's combining all of those and then utilising it in a way. But actually, I think you said in your review actually on the website, if Ewan McGregor could have had that technology back in Attack of the Clones, you would think that he wouldn't be grumbling about walking down
blue ramp.
Yeah, exact blue ramp to look at a blue wall with nothing on it. It's like they said, all the actors could envision exactly what was going on because it's there in front of them. So it's probably quite easy to understate how important it is, but I think this could be quite fundamental for how we see things develop and how we allow bigger budget or maybe productions that would be necessarily unfeasible because of the amount of CG needed in a traditional sense.
You look back at previous productions, you look at this now and you think, well, they're doing what they're doing in the volume. And I love when Kathleen Kennedy mentioned about George, at the bottom of the hill at the ranch and all that, the Grady Ranch thing. She doesn't name it, but she's on about the Grady Ranch.
Yeah.
You look at massive films that have built huge sets, and of course you still want massive films with huge sets, but there's certain movies, and the one I'm thinking of, weirdly enough, is Gangs of New York, the Scorsese film. Now he's gone and done The Irishman, using ILM to de-age a lot of the actors, which couldn't be done years and years ago. But when he made Gangs of New York, I remember reading that Lucas came on the set and basically said, why don't you just get ILM to do this? We could build this huge town and do it for a fraction of the cost. And Scorsese was like, no, I want to build it. And they spent millions and millions and millions building this huge town. I mean, the one thing, there's so many things in this episode, and I can't wait to watch it again. Apart from the fact that Carl Weathers, like you just said about the actors, articulates that so well. In that, you look up, you look down, you look left, you look right, you look behind you, and there's the tunnel shrinking, you look ahead of you, there's a tunnel getting bigger and all that sort of stuff in the lava scene. It's got to be better for the actors. Turn something around in half an hour and change the angle and just shoot and not build sets. And only certain amounts, you got anything that's on the floor they've got to build. It's just tremendous.
You still need a physical set, but from a shooting practical perspective, if you take the Gunslinger episode and that end scene, which was shot with Ming-Na Wen at sunset, traditionally when you film that, you'd have to film it over a course of several days, because obviously the lighting changes so quickly. To basically be able to be in a permanent state of sunset, sunrise, or what have you is really handy. I was listening to an episode of a production podcast or something like that, and they had DOP on from Mindhunter, which is a Netflix series, and they were saying that they basically they had to shoot all these outdoor scenes over the course of 3 or 4 days because the sun kept on changing location, and then of course you have to take a day off because it's overcast, and then you have to come back to it. So this just means that you can really nail down your schedules and say, right, okay, we can shoot all this in a day. It's simple.
There's also the thought that, I'm thinking of Rise of Skywalker, the little mouse creatures with the eyes inside their ears.
Yeah,
that
second
sequence.
Units shot, yeah.
Exactly, and they gone and filmed that out in Jordan, I think it was, or wherever it was, and they filmed it, and they got it at that perfect light, first thing in the first light in the morning. That's very special light, and they shot it and they turned it around as quick as they could because they needed that light. And you think for something like that, for pickups, you can recreate the light. And it's there consistently. It's not going to go anywhere. There it is, And you just mentioned that scene from The Gunslinger with the, that beautiful sort of morning light coming through, and it looked completely believable, more than believable. I mean, nobody knew about stagecraft until The Mandalorian was finished, near enough.
No, exactly.
You know, it's incredible.
You think about all those promo shots that we saw, and we had no idea.
You just assume it was green screen, don't you?
Like it was, you know, it was green screen, or exactly. They've just gone out to, you know, the desert, you know, exactly. Yeah. But it was also fascinating to see how many sets were, like interior sets were in there. Like all the interiors with the client, they were shot in there, and the big space station that was on there, and that's quite fun because obviously there's a lot more busyness going on, a lot more happening in that kind of environment. So yeah, it was a great episode, and I think a real treat for people who've had a chance to watch it.
Hi, I'm Nelson Hall, and I get my Star Wars news from Fantha Tracks.
Anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff, the work of ILM, the stagecraft technology, listen into Making Tracks on Saturday the 30th. That's this coming Saturday. We've got a full episode talking to Hal Hickel from ILM, who you will have seen in Disney Gallery, the Mandalorian episodes in the past, talking about his career, working on Star Wars, working on from Phantom Menace all the way through to the Mandalorian. Coming up now is our first part of our chat with Hal, when he talks about his early career, coming through as an effects artist, what inspired him, what influenced him, and it's the first of 3 parts over the next 3 studio episodes of Making Tracks. So here we are with a conversation with Hal Hickel. I did my research, as I do, and I was completely charmed to find that when you were 12, you sent a letter to Gary Kurtz with a pitch for a sequel to Star Wars. Can you remember what that pitch was?
Something a kid would write. You know, I think I imagined Luke and Leia being together at that point, because, you know, obviously after New Hope, that seemed like what was happening.
Yeah.
We didn't, little did we know what was in store. And they probably had some kids by then that were probably my age that were part of the action. But beyond that, I don't really recall what the actual thing was. Probably, mercifully, it's been forgotten.
So you still got that letter from Kurtz?
I do, yeah. It's on this cool Ralph McQuarrie letterhead.
Oh, awesome.
At the time, when I got the response, you know, I was a little disappointed because it was a polite sort of thank you, but, you know, we've got the sequel covered. We're not taking outside ideas. And, you know, later I sort of realized that A, the letterhead was super cool, and B, that it was because I hadn't written to Gary Kurtz specifically. I mean, I don't even recall who I had addressed my letter to, because I don't remember knowing about a fan club then. But maybe that's what it was. Maybe I'd gotten the fan club address or something. But the other thing I realized later in later years was that the letter had been personally typed by Gary's assistant, Bunny Alsop.
Wow.
Which, you know, it's like you'd think the producer's assistant would have better things to do than answering, because they must have been getting so much, you know, fan mail at that time. But I actually came into contact with Bunny years later on LinkedIn, I think, of all places. And I related the story to her, and she was really tickled by it. And I asked her, I was like, what's the deal? Like, why wouldn't that have been just shunted off to a fan club or something? And she said that she enjoyed replying personally to as many letters as she was able to, and that had to come to an end when they shipped off back to the UK to begin shooting Empire.
Yeah.
But up until that point, she would personally answer as many letters as she could, because she just enjoyed doing it. So I appreciate that. I think that's awesome. And I still have the letter. Yeah, it's framed, and we had a crew breakfast when we wrapped work on Phantom Menace. And, you know, ordinarily people wouldn't, you know, when you're working with the director, you don't bother them for things like autographs and things. But because that was sort of celebratory, a few folks brought over, you know, their Phantom Menace posters or whatever they had at the time. And George very kindly sat and signed them. And so Rob Coleman, who was the animation director on all 3 prequels, had seen my letter. He's like, go get the letter, show it to George. So I got it. I dug it out, and I showed it to George, and he chuckled. And there's a part in the letter where Bunny had written, getting into Hollywood takes a certain amount of a combination of luck and talent, et cetera, et cetera. And so George had underlined the words luck and talent and wrote, you have it, and then signed his name to it. So kind of full circle, closure for me with that letter.
Absolutely. That's a charming story. It really is. When was the moment then as a kid, presumably as a kid, you thought, this is what I want to do, above writing sequels to Star Wars, when you thought the visual side of it was where you wanted to go?
Yeah, it was before Star Wars. It was probably around, 71 or 72. I saw the original King Kong on television.
Yeah.
And got utterly fascinated with how they made it and how they made, this Kong look so huge and all that. And there were a couple of good books that were around at the time. I still have my copies. There were two in particular about the making of Kong. And so that got me interested in stop motion. And then, of course, I'd see, Ray Harryhausen's films, et cetera. And so then when Star Wars came out, I was already doing stop motion with a Super 8 camera. And but Star Wars broadened my interest generally in visual effects to all the other areas, things I didn't previously really understand, matte paintings and animated effects and miniature models and how they're shot with motion control cameras, all that stuff. And at the point in time when Star Wars came out, I had a kind of competing interest. I was a bit of a NASA nerd. I really liked following the latest space program developments and all that. And so part of me was thinking about maybe trying to become an astronaut, as kids do, but of course as people actually do. and as I said, I was quite a nerd about it. So it seemed like a real goal to me, not just like a fantasy. But the fact is, there's a lot of math involved with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, really, it was Star Wars that kind of shifted me for good over to the film side of things. It went from being a hobby, which I was quite interested in, to kind of an obsession after Star Wars came out. So
it strikes me then that if you were a NASA nerd, you would have possibly been aware of Ralph McQuarrie from his NASA work before his film work, because he did the animations, didn't he, for the moon landings?
I wasn't, and in fact, I wasn't. I don't think I was aware generally of artists like that, like Robert McCall or people like that who've done a lot of famous space art. I was really just pretty much interested in the program itself.
Yeah.
Now after that, I became, actually Ralph McQuarrie was probably my entryway into that world of illustrators and concept artists who envision things. Up to then, the odd science fiction book cover might catch my eye, yeah, but I wasn't really aware of a world of conceptual artists and their work until after Star Wars came out, and I started reading everything I could get my hands on about the film, and learned about Ralph McQuarrie and Joe Johnston, and and then later people like Neil Arotis and other people who worked on the Star Wars films, and of course now I'm quite fortunate to work with Doug Chiang. But Ralph was really the person that made me aware of that kind of work. Absolutely.
When you were making your own projects then, I'm assuming that was with friends and colleagues. What sort of stuff were you working on? What sort of stuff were you doing?
I'd love to say that we were making whole entire films, really clever little movies that our families loved. But the fact is we would just go out and shoot goofy stuff.
Yeah.
One day we'd be blowing up models that we didn't want anymore, and we'd put fireworks in them and blow them up and shoot them. Another day we'd shoot kind of a little short film that would have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but it would just be some silly thing about, an alien who appears and disappears, and, one of us would be the alien and the other one would work the camera. And so it was just kind of goofy stuff like that, honestly. We lived up in a little town in Colorado in the mountains, a tiny little community, and it was something to do, particularly during the summer months when we were off school and we had lots of time on our hands. I lived on a cattle ranch, so I didn't have that much time on my hands. There was chores to do, but we'd have a chance to get out and goof around. And so it was that sort of thing. And then on my own, I'd shoot stop motion because that's not as much of a team sport. That's something you can kind of do in solitary. And my mom had helped me make a King Kong puppet from an action figure we had back then called G.I. Joe that was sort of a 1/6 scale. So it was quite, almost a foot tall, and we'd made a gorilla suit for it essentially. and so I'd have him shuffle around, and I didn't understand about tie downs, the little screws you put through their feet to keep them from falling over. So he would just shuffle around and kick toy cars and climb cardboard buildings and things like that. So it was that kind of stuff.
When did it get serious for you? When did you think this is an avenue that I can make a living out of and can become a career?
I think it's super important for young people who are interested in things like this to meet somebody who does it for a living, because then it becomes more real. Because certainly living in this little town of Shawnee in Colorado, nobody in my family worked in the film business. We were in the middle of the country, miles away from California and any sense of the film business. So in that way, it didn't seem particularly real. When the first Star Wars came out, there was a terrific article. It was probably the first great article on visual effects I was able to get my hands on. And it was in a magazine called Cinefantastique, and it was a double issue. And they did a big article on Star Wars, the visual effects of Star Wars, and a big article on Close Encounters, because both of those had come out in the same summer. And in the Star Wars article, they interviewed a bunch of different people on the crew about their jobs. And one of them was this guy, Adam Beckett. And Adam Beckett had been in charge of the animated effects. So, the lightsabers and laser blasts, things like that. And he had personally hand animated the effect of the little blue electrical arcs that crawl all over R2-D2 after the Jawas shoot him. And that effect had really caught my eye. I was really interested in that effect. And so I read his part of the article quite intently, and he mentioned having gone to the California Institute of the Arts. From that moment on, I kind of had that in my brain as my goal from 77 until I graduated from high school in 82. And I was fortunate to have to being accepted. But also in my last summer there in Portland before going to Cal Arts, I just thought one day, there must be some animation companies here in Portland. Portland's a pretty big city. And I looked in the phone book, and sure enough, there was a few little companies, and one of them was called Graphoons, and they did, I'd say local advertising, motion graphics work, title work, that kind of thing, logos. And so I just called them up, and they were super nice. They said, come on by, we'll show you the studio. Now, this was obviously not ILM. This was a small studio there in Portland, but they couldn't have been kinder about just sort of showing me what they do and how it works. And that was really important for me because it made it real. It was like, here are real people who do this for a living right here in my own city. Robin Atherley was the guy that owned Graphoons, and a great designer. He was a very good designer. He and I are still friends to this day. So those two things, kind of reading that article about Adam and understanding what his path was and thinking that it was a path I could take, like, he went to this school. Okay, I will go to that school. And then meeting Robin and seeing their shop also made it feel like, I can picture myself coming in here to work, this being a real thing. I have to thank Jules Engel, who ran the film graphics department at Cal Arts, for accepting me into the program because, I didn't go out and apply at 5 different schools and hope I'd get into one. I just sent a portfolio to Cal Arts and I got in. If I hadn't, I sometimes wonder where I would have ended up. Having it seem like it was an actual thing that people did, which is quite different from just reading about stuff in Cinefex or whatever and imagining it. I think that's what, really helped me get to where I ended up finally.
Yeah. This is Steve Bloom, voice of Zeborelios, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks. Caravast. May the force be with you.
When you are imagining the job as a young man and then actually doing the job, what's the big shock discovery that I didn't expect it to be this? I didn't know it was involving that. What was the big thing that you had to learn that you didn't know?
Oh, tons of things. But I think one of them is, particularly because I had grown up idolizing Ray Harryhausen and Willis O'Brien, I kind of imagined it not being as social a job as it is. Yeah. Because Ray, he had help here and there, but largely it was just him doing it, and that was certainly also the way it was portrayed, which is largely true. It was just Ray in there animating all those skeletons and Jason. There's no doubt about it, and so that was always in my head. Although again, I would say that Cinefantastique article was the first time that impressed upon me the sort of team effort that filmmaking can be. And visual effects, particularly, you've got all these different people who have different skill sets kind of mixing together to make a project. And so, but that I didn't really grok that, really fully understand that until, I kind of had my first actual job. You kind of do have to work with others. And although actually my first job was at a competitor to Graphoons in Portland. only because Grafloons at that point just didn't need anybody. But they said, well, try at this shop over here. They might need somebody, and they were doing motion graphics work, but it was a tiny little shop. It was me and another guy, and then our boss. So essentially, there were three of us, and occasionally another person would be added if we needed them, but generally it was just the three of us, and I would work the night shift, and so for the first good while there, it kind of was a solitary working experience. It wasn't until I got to Will Vinton Studios that I had more of a sense of working in a studio, a proper studio, and on a sort of crew, if you will, of folks on a given project. That reality happened when I got to Will Vinton Studios, and I really liked it. I mean, it was such a great group of people there, and it was a really fun little studio that was kind of riding the wave of a very, at the time, popular IP, which was the California Raisins. And so that's when I really learned, oh, okay, this is like a team sport. This isn't just the solitary animator in their thing. Although with stop motion, once the animator does go in to do a shot, it is quite solitary.
Yeah.
So
I remember the California Raisins really well. That must have been a lot of fun to work on.
It was great fun. It was really good. I mean, I think by the time I'd been there, I spent about 6 years at Vinton's, actually. I was there quite a long time. And, probably 4 years into it, I think all of us were wanting to do stuff that wasn't Raisins. And we were. I mean, Vinton's did a lot of commercial work for all kinds of different clients. But, the Raisins had become the dominant thing because we were doing half-hour specials for CBS, I think, that featured those characters. And, we were all grateful for the work and enjoying ourselves. But, there was a certain part of us that was kind of yearning to move on to something else. But it was such a great time there. It was really fun. And Portland's a great town, and it was great. I think the other thing that can take a while for a creative person to wrap their head around if they want to pursue a line of creative work that is, I'd say more like a craft than a fine art, which I'd say visual effects is this idea that, yes, you're a creative person and you're bringing creative ideas to it, but you're not running the show. You're trying to achieve something for a director, and there are loads of people who have input on your work, the director, the producer. Some people struggle with that when they get in. Like they want to be their own boss, and they don't feel like, well, the producer doesn't know anything about animation. Why are they giving notes on my shot? And, they kind of bang their head against that. I didn't have a problem with that. I guess I was fine with the idea. Like, it just made sense to me. I'm like, well, yeah, filmmaking isn't, it's not a collective exactly. It's like there is a hierarchy. There's a director. That's just the way it is. And I don't know. It never bothered me. It still doesn't. I mean, sure, there are days when you get notes that you think are not going to make the shot better, and you don't agree with them. But that's a very minor thing, and you learn to navigate that and figure out how to still enjoy your work, even though I kind of liken it to being sort of like a carpenter, and someone comes in with a design for a chair, and you look at the design and sometimes you think, oh, that's beautiful. I can't wait to get to work on this. Other times you think, I don't think that's going to be very comfortable, and it's not that attractive, but I will use my woodworking skills to make sure that the joints are strong and, it won't break when people sit on it and that it looks like the drawing that I've been given. And that I'm okay with that, with having sort of that whole range of contribution, from contributing to stuff that you're fully on board with, and you're even given the chance to have a fair amount of authorship over your part of it, to something that's more akin to just kind of executing the idea and getting it done to the best quality you can do. Those are all fine ways to work, and so I just say that's the other thing that isn't just immediately apparent, reading articles and things, when you're sort of dreaming about your job, is that if you're a creative person who's like my brother, who's 2 years older than me, was always much more the fine artist. You know what I mean? He actually we did end up working together for several years at Vinton's, and it was one of the happiest professional times of my life, actually, because I got to work with my brother. But he was always much more the fine artist, exploring painting and sculpture and expressing personal things, whereas I really enjoyed the kind of studio life, working on a crew, making a film. And I don't have to be the director. I'm happy to do kind of my part of it, which is, the animation.
as we count down the days to season 2 of The Mandalorian, one, we've got great news that ILM and the team are still working on the show and that everything's pretty much in the can and that things are progressing nicely. So that's good news. Looks like the show's going to be on time. But as we always get, because it's Star Wars, there's loads and loads and loads and loads of rumours. The latest one being that we've heard Timothy Olyphant is going to be in season 2 of The Mandalorian. The rumour is that he's playing Boba Fett. But the latest rumour is that he's just wearing Boba Fett's armour, and that links into a character that was in Aftermath, Cobb Vanth. What do you think of this, Mark? Does that make sense? I know our friend Paul Bateman has spoke about this in the past. He's said it for years that he reckons that Boba Fett will turn up, but it won't be the Boba Fett we know. It will just be somebody in that armour. This kind of fits with that rumour.
Yeah, it kind of does. If memory serves correctly, Paul's pitch about Boba Fett was basically you see Boba Fett get taken out by somebody else who then basically nicks his armour and then takes on the persona of Fett, which actually is a very nice and astute kind of observation there by Paul, to be fair. The rumour is a notion that was first seen in the Chuck Wendig's Aftermath novel back in 2015 for the Journey to the Force Awakens release. And this was one of his interlude scenes where basically you've got the sheriff from this town in Tatooine who basically buys the Boba Fett costume or a Mandalorian set of armour. Let's be fair, it doesn't, I don't think in the book, state explicitly that it's Boba Fett's, but basically it's hinted at. The Jawas picked up the armour from a wreckage out of the Dune Sea, I believe, and then he's brought it off of that. So it's kind of hinted that actually, whilst Fett may have died, the armour was spat up by the Sarlacc, and he wears it for the rest of the his little interlude.
What do you think of the logic of that? Because obviously, looking back at the film, the sail barge goes kaboom, big time. The Sarlacc's right next to it. You know, there's logic in the thought. Logic. This is Star Wars. It's space fantasy. There doesn't have to be any logic. But you know what I mean. You know. Exactly. Yeah. But if you sort of think about it, if that massive explosion goes off, I mean, I always remember years ago them saying that the Rebo band got out and loads of other characters got out, but you never saw it because it was on the other side of the barge, But hey, why not, But that explosion would have affected the Sarlacc because wreckage would have gone into it. Boba Fett getting spat out makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if memory serves correctly, you had the Dark Horse books basically said that he kind of cobbled together some kind of jetpack or repaired his jetpack and flew out from a Sarlacc. And then also you had the Bounty Hunter Guild Wars books, which basically kind of says that he gets either spat out or basically the explosion kind of affects the Sarlacc to a point where he gets spat out because then he gets rescued by Dengar, which is actually quite a fun story. If you haven't read it, it's well worth revisiting. So it's kind of not necessarily a new concept. It's quite a fun one. I think it would probably serve a really good in-between middle ground between those who obviously consider Boba Fett to be Attack of the Clones Boba Fett the kid and has Jango Fett heritage, and also those who were less inclined to kind of like that imagination from George where we only see Boba Fett as a young kid and prefer to kind of think of him as this man of mystery. Like we said last week, the myth of Boba Fett is bigger than actually the deeds that he's done on screen. I quite like this idea, but also I quite like maybe the idea that actually it is Boba Fett's armour, but actually he doesn't know whose armour it is. It's just Mandalorian armour that he's just happened to acquire. So it might be that actually there's some kind of revelation and it's not necessarily this is Boba Fett's armour. As it's brought out in the Clone Wars, Jango Fett just acquired the armour from a Mandalorian. So maybe there's the heritage of that gets discovered and we find out maybe it could be somebody connected to Din Djarin, for instance.
The armourer might know more because she seems pretty clued up.
Exactly. She'll recognise the signet. That would make sense. What's your thoughts on it?
I'm all for Fett coming back. It doesn't bother me. I think, when you're in a fictional galaxy where Darth Maul can get chopped in half and come back, and Anakin can fall into a pit of lava and come back, and that sort of stuff, that characters can survive and come back. I think if Han Solo would have come back, that would have felt like way too much of a stretch. But
one's
Boba
ever
Fett,
truly gone.
No, Mark. That's very true.
One's ever truly gone.
Especially when you've got Disney Plus.
Exactly.
But, I think Fett getting out always felt logical to me. His jetpack takes a hit, but he didn't get stomped on by a reek, So Jango not surviving the Mace conflict makes sense. Obviously, his head was cut off, but you know what I mean? His jetpack failing. But Boba Fett going into the Sarlacc and 3PO sort of saying, and it's an inference of, it's not, those teeth are pretty much decorative. It's not going to chew you up. No. You fall in and you like falling into a Venus flytrap. He would have time in his helmet with all his gear and stuff. He would have time. He'd probably get acid burns because obviously that thing would digest you. But that's feasible to me, and being belched out by the Sarlacc makes sense. So, and if he does come back and if it is the Boba that we know, the sort of Tamura Morrison Boba Fett we know, fine. If it's a flashback where he gets out and this Oliphant character, whoever he plays, comes along and takes the armor from him or gets given the whatever it might be. That's another thing, is that with technology we've got now, we could easily flash back to moments after Return of the Jedi, and it will look just like Return of the Jedi.
Exactly.
You know, it's so doable. So Fett coming back makes all the sense to me. And again, we talked about it in the other episode, Timothy Oliphant, it's going to be cool having him in the show. He's a good actor.
There's also the risk to productions like this whereby you are hiding a lot of your A-list cast behind helmets.
Yeah.
And now, obviously, if he's just brought the Mando armour, you can totally see him just kind of taking that bucket off and just doing a big piece to camera. I don't necessarily see if he is wearing it, if he's going to maybe be wearing the whole armour for the whole entirety. He might take his helmet off and have dialogue, and then obviously kick some ass with the helmet on. On the other hand, whilst it's quite a fun idea, I just wonder if this is somebody's just stretching a little bit to try and tie up the two disparate kind of rumours. There's this thing, the interludes in the Chuck Wendig novel are there, they are canon. What I'm referring to is they're not necessarily a Legends concept, they're actually something in the new modern era, expanded universe, or new you, as I like to call it. And so there...
Sounds like a Weight Watchers tagline, that does.
I know, it's great, isn't it? Yeah. But I kind of think there's this story thread which has been left hanging, and maybe somebody's gone, oh yeah, it could be that. Who knows? There is the risk that if you bring Boba Fett back into the Mandalorian, our Mandalorian is maybe overshadowed for that one episode by Boba Fett. So and I don't see them doing that. I don't see them putting over another character in spite of our Mandalorian.
The only way I can consider them doing that or see them doing that is if they do bring Fett in and it is Fett and they have a crossover episode and then Fett goes off for his own adventures, and sometime down the line you get a Disney Plus series about Fett. But then maybe that would just feel too much, or the film that we should have got years ago, or maybe that would just feel too similar because, you're basically following another Mandalorian. So, yeah, it's a tough one.
I'm Anthony Daniels, and you are listening to Fantha Tracks. Well done.
So 40 years ago, the first Star Wars sequel, well, the second Star Wars sequel, if you count the holiday special, The Emperor Strikes Back, came out and blew the top off Hollywood and the way that movies were made. We took a little look back at it on Making Tracks last week with some vintage interviews from cast and crew from the film. When was the first time you saw Empire?
I was just a mere glint in my dad's eye when it was released originally in 1980. So I physically cannot say exactly when I saw it for the very first time, but the first time that I saw it, that I remember it as more of a Star Wars fan, was around when I was about 11 or 12. The whole trilogy had been released and it was on VHS, and I borrowed it off my friend Sam, and I rinsed A New Hope about 11 times and then swapped that for Empire Strikes Back and watched that. And for me personally, I was blown away by the visuals, by the Battle of Hoth and the end battle. It had a bit of a lull in the middle, but the Dagobah stuff is a little bit harder to kind of like watch when you've had such a high key opening. But we were then very close to the time that Kevin Smith brought out Clerks, and then suddenly starts, talking about how The Empire Strikes Back is a stronger of the original trilogy because it's darker and stuff like that. And I think at that point, people that I knew suddenly were starting to kind of revisit The Empire Strikes Back and kind of like see it for its merits. I can't say how the initial reception was for the film, if it was as strong as A New Hope or not, because I didn't see it. So how about you? Were you front and centre for the actual original opening?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly when in the year I saw it, but I do remember that my friend Roger, his dad, was the manager of the Burton Odeon. Three of us went to the Odeon. We were given the grand treatment, so it was all the popcorn and ice cream we could eat. And we saw a double bill. I remember we saw Empire along with Herbie Goes Bananas. And I remember... given that I was, nuts about Star Wars, collecting all the toys and the books and the comics and everything else, I remember coming out thinking I really enjoyed Herbie Goes Bananas. But so it's funny. I mean, and I wouldn't have seen Empire again until 82, 83 on a pirate copy, probably.
Gotcha.
Because I do remember very clearly. I remember seeing Jedi before it came out in the UK because my friend's dad worked on the oil rigs out in Saudi. And so he would bring copies back. So it came out in the States in the May. I don't think we got it till later in the summer. So I remember seeing Jedi, and I know that we basically did a triple bill at home of the three films. Yeah, it is for. I mean, how old was I then? May 1980. So I would have been, blimey, 9. So yeah, it is. I mean, the action at the start blows everyone away, but reading the comics, that was our little EU then, was the comics, and, Splinter was out, and I think some of the Han Solo books were out, but, that was really it at the time. So all you knew was the original Star Wars. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those films that's had such a long life. It's a film that we're constantly talking about today, 40 years on, that the conversation's never stopped. The Mandalorian couldn't be more influenced by Empire if it tried. It's gone for all the same silhouettes. It's gone for the Boba Fett silhouette in The Mandalorian. It's gone for the IG-88 silhouette in IG-11. It's just got that whole bounty hunter vibe about it. Picks up what Greedo was talking about in A New Hope and just runs with it. It's a magical film in that sense. And you mentioned the middle scenes, the Dagobah scenes, how now, because we've seen everything that's come since and we've seen all the prequel stuff that went before, all the lessons and all the stuff that Yoda talks about, because any blink, wink, nod, throwaway line is completely and utterly extrapolated to the hilt in Star Wars and always has been. Everything that Yoda says takes on so much more significance, but when you watch it back in 1980 or whenever you first saw it, without any of that other background noise, it is a bit dry initially, and if you were older, you'd read more into it, but when you were sort of 9, it was a much more mature film than Star Wars, which is just a roller coaster action sort of action adventure, which seems quite sedate now compared to a lot of films, weirdly, the original Star Wars, but Empire just pick up the pace in so many ways.
It's a film that it's very easy to kind of study, and an obvious choice to study when you start, when I started looking at film studies and stuff like that. It is a slightly darker film, tonally, and also there's a lot more character introspection, which is vital, I think, because if you take out the middle section, and not only the Dagobah stuff, but if you actually take out the interplay between Han and Leia when they're in the asteroid field around there, and you just put in another action scene, yes, it would be high octane, but probably you may have actually come out of the cinema going, actually, that Herbie film was crap compared to the new Star Wars film. Yeah. It's probably one of the most influential films that has informed, especially, I think, the next generation of filmmakers, like I said, Kevin Smith, but also, you look at the directors who worked on all the Disney era sequel trilogy and subsequent films, they all kind of harken back, and I think more people probably want to make their Empire Strikes Back than they probably do their A New Hope.
I wouldn't argue with that. That's a really good observation, and it has become more of a comparison point for other films than any other film. Dark Knight Returns is the Empire Strikes Back of its trilogy, or pin that on any movie series. It's become that thing, and I know when the film came out, I did a piece on StarWars.com years ago called Critical Opinion, looking at the different films and the press reactions to those films. But it's interesting, especially with Empire. Pauline Kael called it the most beautiful film of the year, because visually, no denying it is. But a lot of the criticism was like, oh, well, this is a drag compared to Star Wars, and this is boring, and that's whatever. It was just a lot of negativity surrounding Empire. And the fans obviously got so gripped by, and we've got to wait 3 years for the next one, which I think Star Wars misses tremendously these days. The anticipation has gone because everything's so immediate.
I'll agree with that, yeah.
That Empire to Jedi stretch was just, it was, I mean, a lot of kids did a lot of growing up in that time, Jedi just came at the right time before a lot of kids would sort of move on to other stuff, and then a lot of us come back to it years later. Some idiots like me never left it. But, there's that gap, and that anticipation's the best word I can think to use. Empire built that into not only into general trilogies, but just movies altogether. I would imagine most directors would like to make their Empire.
Yeah, and, also the whole cliffhanger is, although not a new idea in general thinking, because obviously this is an idea that came from the serials. They literally had cliffhangers sometimes, leaving their actors hanging on the edge of a cliff. But now every trilogy or franchise does it. Probably a really good one is Back to the Future 2, for me anyway. I think that's a great one. Yeah. And also, if we look at Attack of the Clones and also The Last Jedi, they are kind of influenced by Empire, but yet neither of them really have dramatic cliffhangers.
But you look at the end of Empire and they jump into hyperspace, and then you have the scene on the ship with Luke having his hand repaired, and let's all meet up on Tatooine, and that's kind of a bit longer, but it's a similar kind of vibe, isn't it? And Rise of Skywalker's a year after Last Jedi, Return of the Jedi is a year after Empire Strikes Back. You look back to Attack of the Clones, and we know as fans that the Clone Wars is about to kick off. And then you move forward 3 years to Revenge of the Sith, and you catch in the Battle of Coruscant, which is the very end of the Clone Wars. So you've not seen any of it, and thank goodness George did the Clone Wars.
Clone Wars, yeah.
You have that cliffhanger vibe, but in reality, when you think about it, all of them give you a little mini resolution. You know, Last Jedi gives you that little hope that, oh, the galaxy's not quite down and out yet. Empire, oh, well, Luke's got his hand back and they're making a plan to save Han Solo. And Attack of the Clones, okay, at the end of Attack of the Clones is the wedding, and we kind of pick it up sort of 3 years on.
From an ideological perspective, both Attack of the Clones and The Last Jedi have those kind of cliffhangers. It's like, suddenly it's like, what is the galaxy going to be like now without Luke Skywalker? He was going to basically ride in with his laser sword and just save everybody. And again, it's that whole thing of, we left the cinemas in 2002 going, well, I wonder what's going to happen between now and the next one.
Hello, I'm Ahmed Best, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
I watched Empire Strikes Back last night and it went through in a blink of an eye. It doesn't seem to drag these days, and I don't know if it's because I've matured and also I understand and appreciate those nuggets of wisdom from Yoda a little bit more. Because there's one thing that I was just left thinking about last night as I was getting into bed was actually the Yoda that we see on Dagobah who's saying don't go. I don't think he would have said that if Luke had kind of left his training in Attack of the Clones. I think he would have just left him to go. Even though we've not really seen any on-screen development between Yoda from the end of Revenge of the Sith through to Empire. Yeah. He's had a lot of time to think and grow and consider what is the role of a Jedi.
And also in Attack of the Clones there's 10,000 Jedi Knights. In The Empire Strikes Back there's one. But he really was the last. I mean, okay, he says there is another, which was a bit of a leading line. But
yeah, and that's the thing, because he actually says, like, he's very kind of like, you know, the imperative is like, you must not go. Ben, as he lifts off, and Ben's like, that boy is our last hope. And you're just like, there's another.
Felt like a throwaway line to leave dangling for 40 years, or nearly 40 years, didn't it? So.
There is another. Indeed. And also, I really just love just the whole aesthetic of Bespin. Even the apartment that Han and Leia are in, it kind of sings to my kind of like design aesthetic. And then the carbon freezing chamber just looks amazing.
Oh, everything about it. The way it was lit, it's the sexiest Star Wars film. The colours and just everything about it is it's beautifully done.
And you talk about those silhouettes as they're walking into the freezing chamber, everybody's backlit, and it's like you can pick out exactly who is who based on those silhouettes. It's just such a beautifully shot film.
So that's it for episode 39 of Making Tracks. If you want to be a part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit fanthatracks.com or check out the Fantha Tracks app through the App Store to follow us on your mobile device. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions. We didn't do one this week because we were slammed for content, but we hope that you'll send a few more in. So send your listeners' questions to radio@fanthatracks.com. Comment, like and share on any of our social media feeds at Fanthatracks, and be sure to subscribe, leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. That's it for this episode. We will be back on Saturday. Mark, speak to you soon.
Yes, mate. You look after yourself. Stay safe and all that jazz.
All that jazz. I'll do my best, and we'll catch you next time.
Take care.
Thanks for listening. Coming up next on Fantha Tracks Radio, it's Desert Planet Discs.